Hi there, hello, my name's Lance, it's great to see you. Now, today we're going to be doing one of the 1-to-1 speed, real-time draw-alongs, where we draw the entire thing, start to finish, going all the way from sketch, line art, colours, shading, everything. Not sped up, all shown, real-time, and I'll talk through the entire process as we go, explaining all the steps and what I'm doing in the tools through every part of the illustration, again, start to finish, in real time. Now this one's going to come out as a set of 2, with one of them being about an hour long, and the other one being about 2 and a bit hours. The reason I made 2 is that when I made the initial one, it was a bit longer than I expected it to be, so I just wanted to make sure people had the option of something to do if they didn't have the same level of time they're able to invest. Now, outside of that, I've got a couple of other videos on the burn. The composition video is coming along great. The more work I do on it, the more I realize there's more work to do, so still in production. In the meantime, I've got some videos coming on how to do things like mecha, chibis, arm, leg, and torso, bones and muscles. Now, outside of that, there's also going to be a number of spots opening for the in-person classes that I run over Discord. So if you are interested in those, there's going to be updates on where you can lodge your expression of interest and information about the classes, what they cost, what they involve, posted on the Discord. So pop in there and have a look. Now, as always, if you decide to follow along, I would love to see your results if you want to post it in the homework section of the Discord. I've been going through and looking at all of them and hopefully arranging some time to get in and do some actual feedback on them. So if you like what you see, then by all means, like, subscribe, let us know in the comments any questions you have about what you'd like to see in future or questions you've got about the video you just watched. And you can also consider becoming a member on our Patreon as well if you'd like to see the videos happen more often or more reliably. But without further ado, let's get cracking. So to start off, I've got my layers set up. I've got my background and color fill, my sketch, my flats, my skin tone and hair variation, my shading, my inks, my line weighting, and my shines layers. They're all set up, just to remind me what steps I'm doing as I go. Now here's the brush I'm going to use. This is just a hard-edged, round brush. The pressure will control opacity, and that's it. I'm going to use the same brush for the sketch, for the line art, for the shading, for everything. The only thing I won't use it for is one of the effects at the end, where I use a soft brush because I want sort of soft edge to it. Now to begin, I'm going to do just some base forms here. Now this is a chibi, so I'm going to go for a 1-to-2 ratio of sort of head to body, or maybe it's 1-to-3 like total size, I don't know. But I'm starting with just a ball for the head, and I'm trying to fit the sort of torso into that middle third there. So I have like a chest and a pelvis roughly, and just sort of going for re-rounded shapes. Now you can also see that I'm using a very large brush here, and I'm staying zoomed out. This is going to really help me not get stuck into details that I don't want to have. It helps me think of the big picture first and get my layout, my composition, my arrangement all right before I get stuck into the minutiae and the details. So I'm just using a big brush, zoomed all the way out, and I'm only thinking about simple shapes first. Now I'm just getting the arms in here. So just a ball for the shoulders and elbows, and then balls for the wrist and sticks for arms. And I'm adding in the detail of the things that are being carried, just roughly sort of what shapes they're going to sort of occupy. In this case, I've got the swimwear rack in one hand, and it's going to have like the bags of the other hand. Now, I'll start in then on some of the base positioning for stuff on the head. So I'll have the center line for the face. Just sort of pop that in, round it off, and remembering that since this is a chibi, it won't really have a very long head. The heads are basically perfectly round, and that's a good sort of center line there. And now I'm just going to do the basic shapes for the legs. With a chibi, the basic shapes are kind of going to be all there is, so I want to make sure the basic shapes look okay, and then thinking of where I'm going to put the arm and the bag hanging over the inside of the elbow there. And now I'll start working out where I want things like the eye line to be. On a sort of chibi head, you'll want the eye line to probably be around 2/3 of the way down the head, roughly, and add a pretty decent amount of hair as well, like give the hair a lot of volume on top. I'm just trying to make sure I get the roughly the same sort of hair shape and arrangement as the more detailed, the more involved, sort of more realistic one I've got. That's that one you can have a go at as well. Linked in the description, like I said during the intro. And now I've got basically the base forms down. It's arranged roughly where I want it to be, and so it's looking fairly right. I'm just getting those shapes a little sharper there and planning where I want to have some of the masses for things like where the boobs will be, and then where the hair will come down. one of the things that happens with making a character with a head this big is that everything sort of related to the head hangs down really far forward. So a normal sized head, the hair will hang down on the chest, whereas this one, the head's so big, it nearly comes out and clears past the shoulders. And I'm also not going to make a clear definition of the chin. Anywhere where I can skip detail, I will. And so I've got the eyes in, and I'll start with the basic masses for the hair. So just really simple shapes first. And just sort of getting big blobs, and I'll break the blobs up later to turn them into proper hair-looking hair. But for now, just those blobs are enough. And think of where I want the mouth to be. I'm going to simplify this one to the point where there will be no nose. So that's a bit of an adjustment for me. I quite like a little sort of rounded nose. I think they're really cute. But one of the things you'll quite often see with sort of the chibi designs is that they'll skip the nose entirely. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to do the sort of different way of approaching the subject to what I normally do. And so the rest of the front hair there wrapping around the face and sort of framing it. And then where I want the collar to go. Doing a little sort of prep there for the bow and where the simplified sort of torso is going to go with the boobs leading into the shoulders. And now doing just a basic marker for where I want the hands to be. With chibi things like this, you can simplify the hands to just being little sort of nubs. This one I wanted to have slightly more detail on them. The reason being is that on the full one, there's some detail on things like coloured fingernails, and the hands are interacting with objects, so I wanted to give them a bit more depth there to sort of allow that. And now getting the base shapes of where the bow will be along that sort of centre line. Remembering that since the character's torso is turned away to the left, that centre line is going to move around to the left as well. If you imagine drawing a line down the front of an orange, as you turn the orange to the left, that line down the centre of the orange will now be tilted over towards the left. And so the same thing's going to happen here. And now doing the jumper and completely failing to remember which way, what goes over what when you tie a knot with that, but we'll see how we do. And then just drawing a line across through the legs there, because I want the jumper to have a consistent start and end point on both sides. And since it's a sketch, I can just draw straight through whatever I'm doing, because nothing here is going to be retained. This is all just information to inform the inking that I do. So now I'm just doing a more finalized bit of shape for the simplified legs. They're essentially sort of carrots. They sort of narrow down towards the end. You can simplify them even more than this if you want to. I just sort of wanted to keep a bit of the shapeliness to show that this is like a chibified kind of sexy character. And now I'm just going to get the lasso and move a few things around. For those of you following on with pencil and paper, I apologize. You can still do this with pencil and paper. What you do is you put a blank piece of paper over the graphite, draw on the back of that, then erase what you've drawn, and then trace the thing you've got now as a sort of carbon copy. Bit involved, but you can do it. And just fixing up the collar there, and the placement of things like the shoulders as well. And just having a poke around to see what sort of things I need to sort of define better. And then thinking about with that, I can now add other accessories like the hair coming off the side there, and trying to keep it roughly the same sort of arrangement as the more detailed image as well, just so it has that clear communication that it's the sort of the same character. And then just some very simplified folds on the inside of the elbow there to show that the shirt is being folded. I do apologize if the sound of the neighbours mowing comes through. We'll see how the NVIDIA broadcast comes through. And so now I'm just going to rearrange this and sort of tilt it out a bit, just so it's got a similar bit of motion and action. The character's quite cutesy and small, but it's also fairly actiony, so I thought I'd sort of better enhance that by making sure that anything that can be off-center aligned is done so, and you know, it's got that dynamism there. And so I'll do a much more simplified version of this than I did in the other one, with much sort of wider edges to it, just so it's easier to make out in sort of chibi pattern. Now with that, I'm just going to make sure I add the eyebrows in. I'm terrible for forgetting eyebrows. And then adding some of the more of the base shapes around the front of the hair there. And where I plan to have those two sort of side locks come down, or side bangs, side sec. I'm sure there's a word for that. If anyone knows the word for those bits of hair that happen on the side, not the sort of front bangs, but the side bangs, I'd love to hear what the word is for that. And now just doing the sort of shopping bag over the other arm. So very just simple square shape and a few straps coming into the where the elbow fold is. That's largely all of the surfaces done. I'll still have to do some basic silhouettes for the hair, but it's looking fairly straightforward there. And I'm just going to grab the lasso now and move stuff around anywhere that needs to move, anything that needs to be in a different spot. Just those little last bits of fine tuning, make sure everything's where I want it to be, getting all the tilts right, that sort of thing. Again, for those in pencil and paper, my condolences. And just moving things where I think they look a little bit better. And rotating them, because it has more of a sort of cat's eye kind of style in the other one, so I want to sort of match that, because this one had sort of flat level eyes, so I'm just sort of tilting them in a little bit. That's out, that looks nice. And then doing a little bit of adjustment on the jawline. So one thing you'll notice about me, I'm terrible for the jawline. Forever tuning, forever umming and ahhing, forever sort of wondering whether I've put it in the right spot. It's a known issue. It's what we're working towards. Groovy. And now just going to grab some of the other detail elements here. So I'll grab the chest first of all. Make that one a bit bigger so it fills in a bit more just below the neck and shoulders there. Just adjusting the position then of the collar as well. One of the other things I realized is in the original, I've got her wearing a little choker, which means I've got to have a bit more sort of visible neck and collar there to give myself the sort of space to put that in and sort of have the space for that detail. So I've got to open the collar up a little bit, so I just need a bit more room for that. That's looking about right. And now just getting a bit more detail around the shoulder as well. And the hair, having those sort of crease folds, so having it really straight and then start to curl towards the bottom. It's something I've talked about a bit in whenever I draw hair, is that hair will have a natural level of curl to it, and its ability to express that curl is relative to how much gravity is pulling on it. So you can see the hair on the ends is really curly, but on the top of the head it's almost exactly straight. And that's because the hair on the top of the head has all the hair below it pulling down. So it has a lot more effect of gravity flattening it. So I'm trying to remember just to curl towards the ends of the hair there to make sure I'm communicating that weight and more sort of natural sort of pattern with the hair. And then doing a bit of the basic outline of the hair. And you can see this is all fairly loose. I'm not refining any of it. There's plenty of construction lines everywhere. And now that I've done it, I can move on to my inks. So, ink layer, same pen. The only difference is it's the same hard brown brush, but this one's got a bit of smoothing on it, so it just sort of smooths the line out. I have very sort of shaky hands, so I have to use one of these to get a smooth line, otherwise it'll look like I've drawn everything in an earthquake. I'll start then just trying to get an idea for how thick I want the brush to be. So I do a few test strokes, see if I like how thick it looks. And that's looking a bit better. So about 10 pixels is probably what I want for this one. You'll obviously have a different measurement on yours because your canvas size may be different. I'm working on a canvas that's essentially an A4 sheet at 400 dpi, so relative to that, that's what sort of 10 pixels wide will be. And then I realized that the hair on the original one has a sort of sideways direction to it, so I'm trying to keep that sort of sideways flow. And then just doing some simple lines for those bits of hair on the side there. Remember with the Chibi one, it'll have a lot of simplification just as part of the style. So I've got to remember that whenever I'm doing it, if I do too much detail, that'll distance it from its sort of core design element. Here I'm going to take my first stab at the jawline. Again, jawlines are a thing I take a bit of time to get right, so I always do a few goes at it until I like what I'm getting. The other thing is, even though I'm not doing line art across the chin, I'll do the line art all the way across anyway and rub it out, just so that sort of makes sure that the line art on either side matches up and sort of flows together. So one doesn't start slightly too high or slightly too low, and it'll have a sort of natural mismatch. This way, I can have it automatically the right way around. So I'm just doing the scrunchie here on the side, that big sort of pink scrunchie that's holding the hair in. And then hair over the top there. And now with the hair gone over the top, do a bit around the rest of the image, moving down a little bit. So trying to work sort of top to bottom. Just be kind of regular with it. One thing that's really important about being sort of methodical is, if you're anything like me, and I miss things constantly, is it's a good way to not miss things. So if you're doing the image all over the shop, you're doing like the top, then the bottom, somewhere in the middle, etc., etc., being methodical gives you a much lower chance of missing stuff. Here I'm just going to redo that jawline there a little bit. It's my white whale. And I'm just rotating the canvas there because it can be a lot easier to do those curves at a certain angle. You'll notice your hand will tend to make curves naturally. If you're right-handed, that'll be the left side of a circle. And if you're left-handed, it'll be the right side of a circle. So it can be often quite valuable to rotate the canvas or flip the canvas to get those lines right. So I'm just grab the ear and put the ear there. Remember, the top of the ear will be level with the midpoint of the eyes. And then starting on some of the hair, a little sort of mini ponytail there. Just drawing those lines down and around. Now, since I've got my smoothing up fairly high, if I try and change direction, it'll take the corner off the stroke. So I'm doing a stroke down, stroke up, stroke down, stroke up. And then just getting those big shapes as we move down the image. I'm trying to sort of simplify the hand without losing a lot of that detail. Because I do want to have sort of fairly simplistic hands on this one. I had a test version of this I did before, and I simplified the legs quite a bit, but I didn't simplify the hands very effectively, so that's an opportunity there. Now just draw the neck down, the line for the choker across. And then some simple lines for the inside of the collar. Now, one of the things you'll hear me say is don't use Control-Z, but if we're doing inking, use Control-Z. Don't spend forever on it. Like if you're there, doing battle with one particular line for however long, then, maybe concede that battle and work on the war. Yeah, just doing the bow here. And just big, simple shapes. So big curved lines coming out, and sort of very sort of subtle pinch point or sort of bow in on the sides. Then a bit more at the shoulder there. You'll notice there's a couple of bits where I've gone over the lines. I can just come in later and delete that, or I can be careful in the spot, so I'm not terribly concerned about those, especially given how much they'll be on the image. it won't really be very noticeable having one or two bits over the sides. So now I'm just doing the cuff of the arm on the right. I'm going to try for some fairly simplified detail on the hands. I might change the hand position here so it's tilted more back and more upwards, just so it really sort of communicates that holding the object up. And then the curve of the clothes hook at the top. And then just doing a simplified overall shape, which is much more simple than the one I used for the more sort of semi-realistic proportions one, the non-chibi one anyway. And that's looking good. And now again, I'm just deleting out some of the lines, and you can see I'm cutting out bits here, so I can then draw lines through those gaps and have them bulge out on the sides. So it's much easier to cut the lines out ahead of time. And then just doing the bikini string, or straps, or whatever they're called. Top. Side bits there, and you can see having that sort of gap cut out already really helps do those sort of lines in without having to clean them up after the fact. I can just cut the little channels out for them and draw the lines in. Lovely. And then just do the string tie at the back of the neck for it. And then the hands, or the hand on the right anyway, and then a bit more of the cuff coming up. Some more creases for it. And then bring a line down here. And you see that sort of V shape at the top there, that collecting line there. So that's where the lines of fabric are going to make a radial fold between the top of the boob and the underarm there, where the clothing compresses down. And then I'm doing the band of extra cloth for the buttons along the front. And here I'm trying to remember how the tie of when you sort of tie a jumper around your front actually goes. I think I got it this way, even though the sketch was a bit wobbly. And then just trying not to do a line for the difference in the sleeve and the very end of the sleeve there. So if I do a line all the way across, I can make it feel like a different object, where it's the same object, I just want to sort of communicate an edge. And just some really simplified sort of square shapes for the pleats in the skirt. And just moving up and making sure that they get narrower and narrower as we get towards the edge. And then very nice, simple line for the leg. And then a bit more of the detail on the leg there, where it comes down. And then following the line in, and just keeping those shapes really simplistic. Trying to make sure that the shapes in the leg overall taper from thick to thin. So the limbs will always be thicker towards the core of the body. So long as they're moving further away from the body, they should overall be getting narrower and being drawn narrower. And now just doing some of the lines for the bag there. I'm not being very sort of specific with it. I just want to make sure there's some fairly angular shapes in there. And that'll make it look like a bag. As long as the shapes are angular, the shape language will make it read okay. Okay, that's looking alright. Missing bit on the hair there. And missing bit on the jacket at the bottom. And then the elbow on the outer edge. And then some more of those creases on that top surface there on the boob. And then just neatening up a couple little stray bits. missing lines there on the midsection. Now switching the sketch on and off, that can be a really good way to find out which bits you've missed. Sometimes if your sketch is fairly heavy, it can sort of fill in the gaps of things you haven't actually inked yet. So flicking the sketch layer on and off is a good way to sort of throw those differences into relief, and that way they'll show up immediately. And I've realized there's a couple little bits of detail on the face here I'm missing, and I want to get the shape of the mouth just right, since it's going to be such a focal point. I want it to be really rounded. That's pretty good. And then simplified teeth there, and maybe a little fang, because I think the fangs are cute. And then do some simple lines for the eyes. Now I'm going to come back over this and do some line weighting, where I'm going to add some thickness to different bits of line based on a few different things. I'll talk about what the decisions are behind that in a second. But for now, I'm just marking out where I'm going to have those lines, and then I'll do the depth of them when I get there. So I'm trying to do the eye shape here. I want it to be overall round, but with a flat edge on it, and I want to sort of do the corners of that. So it's not necessarily sort of a round shape, but really not a square one either. A crease above the eyes. Remembering to do the eyebrows this time, because I keep forgetting. Then also realizing I've got some hair that's supposed to sort of come in and frame the face on this side, so I've got to redraw that bit in. That's pretty nice. It's sort of largely coherent, adding another little sort of line there just to communicate that band of hair, or the difference between the sort of side and the back hair. Okie dokie. Likely okay. I'm just going around and checking it now. Think if there's anything I've missed. And so now, when I flick the sketch off, I'm going to colorize that naive line art, and then go to a separate layer. You can see the line weighting layer. And now I'm going to get the sketching brush, set it to hard black, no smoothing, and I'm just going to darken all the little bits of ambient occlusion. So anywhere where two surfaces get very close and pinch together, you'll miss out on ambient light. And so when that happens, you darken it. So I'm just adding a few bits of that, and realizing I've got some hair to sort of frame the face on this side as well. I'm going to clear that out on that layer, and then come back in on this layer to add those extra bits of ink. Because those bits of hair that sort of come over the face there really do sort of help frame the features. And so I'm just going to try throwing some tone on here, see if that comes up thick enough. I'm still not sure if it is thick enough. But... And then I'll do some eyelashes, maybe that'll give it sort of some visual dynamism to make up for the sort of narrow eyelashes, but I'm probably going to have thicker eyelashes. Or at least upper eyelashes. One thing about eyelashes is thick lower lashes can be very good for making a character look sort of fancy and mature. Whereas Chibis, they're more sort of cutesy. And so if you want something that's really cutesy, you have a much heavier, a much more detailed upper eyelash than a lower eyelash. So here I'm just turning the image on its side, just because it's easier to make that curve, since I'm right-handed, if the shape is bowing out to the left. And I want to have a really consistent curve there, so rotating the picture really helps. And now I'm just adding a few more eyelashes in there, because this is someone who's, supposed to be sort of made up and so forth, so I imagine they've got eyeliner going. And so big solid bits of black. And then a few more eyelashes on top. Not too many, because I still want this to be a fairly simplistic looking thing. So I'm going to be sort of fairly sparing with the detail that I add. In fact, I've probably added a bit too much detail already. I could have gotten away with it being a bit simpler, but I'm not a sort of simplified style person myself, so that'll be a lesson to learn. I'll do a Chibi video coming up, and it'll be a good chance to practice that sort of withholding of detail. And so now I'm doing those little pinch bits anywhere where two surfaces get close. I'm just going to add that ambient occlusion, so things like where the scrunchie touches the hair, etc. and under this bit of hair here. And again, this bit here as well. A bit more. The next thing I want to do is get the neck right. One thing that can be really handy when you're doing an extra layer of ink is you can choose whether it goes on the inside or the outside, which doesn't sound like a very big difference, but here I noticed when I did this that the bottom, like towards the neck, the line art kind of felt like it was going down too low, that bottom edge of the face was a bit too curved in, when I wanted it to be more sort of rounded and squarish towards the bottom, instead of being pointy. So now I can continue that line art on the inside edge, and that subtle little difference will just overall change the curve of that line under the head there, and that'll really help communicate a more sort of square or flatter bottom line to the jaw there. Hopefully make it look a bit cuter. Although it's already pretty cute. And then just more of those bits of ambient occlusion. Now, if you are interested in ambient occlusion, I've got a whole video on lighting, which I can link for you. I'm doing a bit more of those little bits of ambient occlusion. This bit can be a bit sort of time consuming, especially on a larger piece. One of the things I'll quite often find myself doing is, while I'm doing these sort of details, since the process of adding these can be a bit mechanical, this is when I'll watch some, listen to some YouTube long form essays. I'll sometimes listen to someone go on a sort of deep dive about some esoteric part of history, or some archaeological thing, or dinosaur. Oh, I saw one that was like someone's favorite fossil. It was like a dinosaur thigh bone they'd found. And so, because a fossil is where there's the void and it's sort of filled in with rock, what it had filled in with him was an amethyst geode, and so it was like a bone that was like a geode inside. It was very cool. That's me getting distracted there. Yes, adding just more of these little bits of black. This does go for a minute. This is entirely optional as well. I just like the sort of depth it gives to the inking. A bit more. And around the sides there. Anywhere I can see a sort of pinch in or a crease, I'll add it there. Or any missing bits of line art, which are going to happen, because again, I do miss things. And a bit there where things sort of get close together, like the surfaces there of the legs. Any missing bits of line, like that bit there on the thigh. And the missing bit of the skirt that I've also forgotten. And so having those as two separate colours can really show me where I haven't done that. Now the next thing I want to do is, since this is going to be more of a sort of graphic design kind of thing than a illustration, I'm going to get my inking brush, put the smoothing all the way up and make it a little thicker. And I'm going to add a thick line around the very outside just to really carve it out as a design, to really sort of nail its shape out of the frame. And so I'm just going to go around that, essentially sort of where you would cut out with scissors. And then around the bottom. And some of these can be a bit tricky if I don't get the line quite right. So one of the problems with smoothing is it'll tend to sort of make straighter lines and sometimes smoother edges, but it's harder to make smoother edges because it'll want to go from point to point. So your curves will actually end up being a bit sort of sharper with the smoothing tool on in a lot of ways. And just sort of trying to keep track of where the outside edge is. Around here. And then around the outer edge of the sort of bikini rack there. Sort of starting on the right hand side because I can't see through my hand. Although, you can because you're looking at the video of the results. But I have the line sort of come a bit too far away from the line it's supposed to be wrapping. And then these inside edges, I'll do them as well because they're sort of the outer edge of the object. These can be a bit busy, so if it is an object like this, I'm wondering if maybe this one would have been better off without those internal thickened lines. It's a bit of a near thing, because it's too detailed and you have these thickened lines. They can actually end up adding a significant amount of dark tone from the amount of line art there, so like cross-hatching. And so here, I wonder if I'm still tossing up on it, whether this was the right call, adding thickness to the inside edges of that, but either way. There, and you can see I've left the original a bit, and I've got a bit of a gap there, and that's fine. I can just come back in and add a little extra bit to collect that. It doesn't have to be an exact thickness of line, as long as it is the thickest line is around the outside, and then I can change that as I move inwards. Starting around there, and then do the one underneath it. 49, 50, 51, and then some line around the top, and this should pretty much close off the shape. And so what that does, the thicker line will separate the object. So in this case, that thick line is going to separate the character from the background. Now, an extra little bit of line, not as thick as the outside line, but thicker than the inside lines, you can use that to separate internal objects. So here, I want that hair, or the two bits of hair on the side, to be more separate from the body around it. Just like you can see I thickened the line around the head, the face, that helps separate this out. So I'm using some thicker lines, not as thick as the outline, but still a bit thicker than the internal lines, to really sort of separate some of the parts of the image from each other. And so now with those, I'm just checking around the image to see if there's any bits I missed, and there is. I want to have this bit sort of separate out from the face a little bit, on that side as well. Now that's looking pretty good. So I'll turn off the layer coloring, and then I'll merge all my inks into one. And so with that, I can now work on my flats. Now the flats are going to be pretty straightforward. This is going to be essentially pale hair, darkish skin, greeny blue eyes. I've already got the colors set up from the other illustration, so I know what they're going to be roughly. Finding them again might be a bit tricky, but overall it can work. So I'll start tuning some of the colors in first. So what I want to do is start with, I guess, some of the skin colors first, and find a nice sort of skin color. So that's going to be sort of orangey pink, sort of a pale orange color. I'm going to dump, since the skin tone is going to be the most important color to get right, I'm going to drop it in first and then tune it. Now here, since I don't have a line art section to separate out where the whites of the eyes will be, I'm just going to use the pen tool to cut some sections and sort of define where the whites of the eyes will be. And I can see now that I missed the white of the eye on the left-hand side of the eye on the right. So if you are following along at home, make sure you don't miss that one, because I have to come back and fix it, but you don't necessarily have to. And so now I'm just throwing some skin tone down. Now the skin tone will always look a bit too dark when you put it on a white canvas, just because anything against white will look really dark. So even a very pale grey will look quite dark against white. And so by that same token, you can have, a very dark colour and then have an almost black grey over the top and it'll look quite pale. So it can sometimes be better to tune your colours later, so you can sort of tell them apart from each other. And so here I'm just sort of tuning it maybe a bit darker, a bit lighter, just getting the colours right on that one with the hue and saturation adjustments. That's Control U on the keyboard if you're in Clip Studio. And then just changing it to be a more sort of darker, more saturated orange with a bit more red in it, and just sort of twiddling back between those until I get a colour I like. Now once I've got a colour that I think sort of fits, I'll start dumping in some of the other colours as well. Again, I don't have to be as careful with them, I just want to make sure the skin tone's right. So for the eyes, I'm going to go with more of a sort of bluish green. And that works pretty well. And I want to try and, where I can, reuse the colours. One thing that's really good about reusing colours is, firstly, you don't have to pick new ones, but also it makes the image a lot more cohesive if you have the same colours used in a lot of places. So there's my base blonde. That wasn't quite the right blonde. That's the one. I wanted a more of an orange blonde. picking out all little bits there. Now the bucket fill tool will leave these little white specks here and there, but they're not really much of a thing to worry about, just because you can use the correct Lineart tool, which is meant to sort of thicken and narrow line art you've drawn, but it works better, to my view, on the flats. And so you can have your flats expand a little bit. Most other software has a similar thing. If it doesn't, you can just sort of clone your flats when you're done. Do a Gaussian blur by 3 or 4, and then just clone that layer a bunch of times, merge them in, and it'll have the same net effect. Can take a minute, but... And so I'm just doing this shirt here in an almost white blue. It's almost white, sort of greeny blue. Should have done more sort of a bluey blue, but it is what it is. And one of the main reasons why that hue matters is because I'm going to be later on using the flat colors. Since the flat colors are all in one layer, I can use them as an object to inform how the shading will behave, and I can use that to automatically control what color and how light and dark the shading is. Instead of having to manually pick the right shading color, I can just shade with whatever I want and have the flats control the shading. We'll get to that in a sec. So for now, I'm just throwing in some more tone. If you're having trouble seeing the white or almost white objects, whether they've been filled, you can turn off the paper and it'll show that checkerboard pattern through, and that can really help you sort of see where you may or may not have missed bits of white, or maybe have a sort of pale blue. So I'm going to reuse the color then from the jumper around the waist for the shopping in the bag, and then go for a more sort of dark brown, the shoes, but maybe more of a sort of cooler, grayer color. So sort of desaturated purple can work quite well. That way it won't sort of fight with the color of the jumper, but at the same time it'll still contrast enough to be a separate object and a separate color, and I can reuse that for the choker as well. Now I'm going to get the color for the little ribbon there on the front. It's just a really sort of cheerful red. I'm going to get a sort of pale fleshy pink. It's a bit too dark. I need a bit more sort of lightness and a bit more color there for it to look right. That looks pretty good. And then I'm going to grab that pink from the scrunchie to do the bikini. But that's a bit too much. So even though it's not fully saturated anymore, it's still a bright color. Like, the whole thing is quite colorful, but I haven't had to go all the way fully saturated anywhere, because that's, that never quite represents very well. It gives a real sort of MS Paint vibe. I'm trying to find a good color for a sort of bronze brass sort of hanger here, and that one's sort of too much of a fleshy color. A sort of different one, more of an orangey sort of color, maybe a sort of paler yellow. That one's too dull. It's kind of warmer orange, not quite. More red in it, I reckon. Quite close to the hair, but it'll do. And so next thing, I'm going to reuse the green from the eyes to do the shopping bag, which is what I did on the original one, I think, too, as well. And then grab some more of the hanger for the little hook that's being held in the hand. And fill any of those little random gaps there. And adding in that bright color for the nail polish. And now I'm making a selection from the flats, and then inverting the selection. The reason for this is if I fill in white where the eyes are there, it'll actually bleed out into the skin, and I'll have to sort of delete the edges in, so it can be good to just make a selection from the existing flats, flip that selection, and that way you don't have to worry about it sort of bleeding in and overwriting any of the already drawn flats. And so now I'm just doing a couple of these little bits that the bucket fill's just not going to play ball with, so things like the bottom of the shoe there. Okay, so now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and filter and do adjust line width. So this is filter, correction, adjust line width, and I'm doing this to the flats. So what this does is it makes the flats sort of bleed and spread out. The reason why that's really useful is it sort of fills it all the way out to the edges there, and it gets rid of a lot of those little white gaps. So here I'm just making it wider and wider to the point where it's not leaving the edges of the line art, but it's still filling in, and it's going to get rid of a lot of those little white specks that are left behind by the bucket tool. Because the bucket tool saves a lot of time, but it does make those little white specks, which can be a pain. So now I've got the line art selected, I've got an overlay layer to it, and I'm just going to soften that to more of a sort of dark red, maybe sort of cooler dark purple. That's alright. That's sort of softening it and warming it up a bit. So the next layer I've got in the stack here is my skin tone and hair variation. So what this is it's a layer on top of the flats. It's not for shading or anything, it's just for things like where the color varies on things. So the first bit of variance is, of course, skin tone. So even on a very sort of simplified character like this, it can be really handy to have a bit of variation in the skin tone, so a bit of blush on the cheeks, or on the knuckles, the wrists, the shoulders, the knees, anywhere where bones come close to the surface or cartilage comes close to the surface, like ears. Having a bit of red there can really help sort of characterize it as being a bit fleshy. And the other thing I wanted to do with this is have some two-tone hair as well. So the hair on the character has sort of like that character from Martin, I forget the name of the show, which has got a sort of pink hair towards the ends of the hair, like maybe it sort of was pink and it's grown out. And so with this, I'm going to make a selection of just the hair. Now I do that by setting the flats layer as a reference layer with that little lighthouse icon in the layers tab. And now on the magic wand tool, whenever I select on a layer, it'll select just the flats in that color. And so now I'm on a separate layer with a selection made of the hair color, and I can just paint in some pink, and it'll only affect where the hair is. It's on a separate layer, so it doesn't actually affect the flats. But it's a good way of getting just sort of control over your selection once you've got the flats in. The flats are really useful for a bunch of things. And so here, I'm going to deselect the lower part of the hair that isn't those two bands, because I want those two sort of front locks to have the gradient behave slightly different on them. So I'm going to remove everything that's on the lower part of the head that isn't those locks. I'm just getting confused there, so I'm putting the cursor up while I remember which way around I want to go to make the selection work. And so now you can see I've got a selection that's just the front hair and those side locks. And so I'm going to get rid of the existing pink overlay on them and add a bit more with that big soft airbrush, because soft airbrush is not for shading, but soft airbrush is good for effects like this one. And then adding a little bit of pink to those front bits of the fringes there on the bangs, and just the tips of the hair as well. Now I will start doing the shading. Now the shading color that I pick here isn't very important. Typically I tend to go with a fairly light, fairly desaturated sort of purplish pink, and that works quite well. Now the thing to remember is, since a little bit further down the line, once I've marked out where I want all the shading to be, I'm going to use the flats to make a color controlling layer that will control the hue and control the lightness of the shading layer. This doesn't matter too much what color this looks like in the shading, but I'm still going to have a bit of it show through, so a bit of purple is quite nice because it makes the fleshy tones look really nice. It sort of brings focus to them, but over things like green, it'll really deaden the color. So if your character has a lot of green, or it's a very sort of blue thing, you may want to go for a different color as your base color for shading. This one's just very good for sort of fleshy tones to sort of bring attention to them. And so now I'm just getting, with, again, same brush, just the hard-edged round brush with pressure for opacity. I'll draw some in, and when I want to have a sharp edge, I just cut some out. One thing that can save you a lot of time is when you're drawing with any brush, in Clip Studio the shortcut is the C key on the keyboard. What that does is it turns whatever brush you're on into an eraser in that shape with that behavior. The reason why that's really handy and better than just switching to the actual eraser is that, for instance here, if I'm doing detail in at about that size, I want to have an eraser that's about that size as well. Whereas my eraser might be set up to be a big soft eraser for something else I was doing. So just using the brusher on as an eraser, here I finally noticed that I had left the whites of the eyes blank on that side, so I'm just filling that in there. And so yeah, so pressing C to turn your brush into an eraser with the same behavior means you'll be erasing in the same way. So you may be doing inking and you want to cut the inking away with a sharp edge. Press C, your pen tool is now a pen eraser. You might be doing soft shading, soft brush, press C, now it's a soft eraser. So it can be very handy since it matches the behavior of the current brush. And so here I'm just doing a bit of shading on the inside of the mouth, and I don't want too much there. Again, most of the shading I'm doing, I'm sort of peeling back as I do it. So I'll pen some in, and then I'll pull some out as well. Now the other thing I want to do with the shading is not go too detailed with it. I know I probably already am going a bit more detailed than this should get. It's a nice sort of simplistic chibi. But I want to do mainly some separations here. So shading is not just about sort of showing what's lit and what's not. It's your opportunity in deciding how to separate your image and give it depth. So in here, I'm focusing on getting a really dark surface plane for the hair behind the neck. And you can see here, for that hair that's beside there, I'm doing a big plane of shading around it to really separate that out and give that section of the head some depth. So don't worry too much about the individual bits of detail when you're shading. What can be a lot more effective is to do bigger, larger, more bold sections of shading to really separate objects from each other. So don't be afraid to just shade out whole areas if you feel like that's what you want to do. And where you can, like for instance here under the hand, always try and find places where you can drop a shadow, like have a shadow cast down. They're really easy to do and they give you a lot of depth just straight off the bat. So I rotate this around just to make that curve of just to make drawing that curve there a bit easier, just because it's an easier angle to draw it on. And then just getting in some of those little gappy bits there and brush strokes. So I do want it to be sort of a clean, sort of cel-shaded-y sort of look. Now the other thing you'll notice is the shading layer. I made an alpha mask for it. What that means is I did a control click on the thumbnail for the flats, which makes a selection out of whatever's on the flat. So whatever's on that is now the basis for a selection. And then with that selection active, I hit the make layer mask with the shading layer selected, and now it makes a mask. The net effect of that is that it's impossible for me to shade outside the lines now. So I don't have to worry about leaving the image. The shading can only show up where the flats are present. Now if I add more flats to it, that won't automatically update, but I only need it for a bit while I'm doing this bit of shading, so it should be okay. Getting a selection then on the skin tones, and you can see again, since the skin tones are on the flats and the flats are set as the reference layer, the way the magic wand will behave is whenever I click on something, it'll look instead of the layer I'm on, or the whole image, it'll just look at the flats layer, see what's there, and make a selection out of that. So I'm just doing the drop shadow onto the skirt here, and then deciding that one of the legs, I can send that leg back if I just shade out the entire lower half of it. And I'll leave the other leg largely unshaded. I'm going to do just a couple little pinches of shade on the sides of the kneecap there, just to give it a bit of sort of implied shape. Even though there won't be very much to it at all, but I still want just a little bit there. Yeah, that's working. And so now I'm going to do the shading for the chest. So I'll do a drop shadow of the bow onto the upper surface of the bust there. And then remembering to just do a big area of shadow it's really advantageous to do big areas of shadow where you can, to show the surface planes. It's all sort of surface planes all the way down, and once you've got that, you can then go in and provide detail, but quite often you'll get better result with big, bold shading decisions and maybe a couple little bits of detail. So here I'm going to do little bits of sort of the crease there where the shirt is pulling on what, where a button would be. And so I'll draw some tone in, and then I'll carve some tone out. So smoothing those shapes out like that. Good. I can move on now to the jumper. Now the jumper is going to be fairly straightforward. There'll be a lot of cast shadow from the boobs over that part of the body there. So I'm going to do a bit of that, like not too much, but I still want to sort of imply that they're coming fairly far forward. And so I'll do that sort of top cast shadow where they're picking up the shadow cast for the boobs. And then some shadows coming from the side there for those corners for where the fabric would be creasing, because it'll gather up around the sort of waist where it's being pulled tight, and so that's where those radial folds will come from those edges there. And then the behind part of the jumper that's behind the skirt there. And then just some simple, very, very simple creases and bits of shadow there for the sleeves. Now I'm wanting to have some creases towards the bottom of them to show that they sort of cinch into that band there, but it's not really working. There'd be more sort of cinching in where they come down from where they've been tied in a knot, so I thought I'd sort of reprioritize that and put some of that shading there just to make it look like they're sort of folded in. I could have probably put them a bit further out to the side. The fold's a bit too close to the center, but that's alright. Some symmetry is fine. And then a bit of shadow cast from the jacket onto the skirt. It's looking okay. I'm seeing any bits of shading that I've missed. And also considering doing some extra little strokes there. The blush wasn't quite cutting it on the cheeks. So I'm going to add some strokes there, so some line work, to just help communicate that sort of blush there. So it can go on top of the shading just fine. And just sort of find the right amount of it and the right sort of pressure to put. And I just want a few strokes there. I don't want too much for it. I just want a bit. And now, so I've made a clone of the flats. I'm moving it above the shading layer. I'm changing the hue and saturation. So I'm taking the hue down by about 1520. And I'm taking the lightness down by about 1520 as well. And then I'm clipping that to the shading layer. What that means is the shading layer is now behaving as though I shaded with a darker version of each of those colors. So instead of picking out a darker version of each color, I just shade on the shading layer, and the layer above it will say that you actually shaded with this different kind of brown, this different kind of yellow, instead of me picking out individual ones, because that's one of the weaknesses with multiply shading. Now the next thing I'm going to do is do a sort of drop shadow. So that's why I've removed the mask from the shading layer, so I can now shade outside where the flats are. And I just want to have that sort of drop shadow under the character there, just to sort of, attach them to the ground at least. Like, they're not going to be very detailed or in a detailed environment, but I still at least want them to be attached to the world. So a shadow is a great way to attach a character to a thing, or attach, for instance, you can see the shadow under the chin, onto the chest there. And that's attaching the character to itself. That's giving them depth within that. So I'm just carving the shadow shape out. Doesn't have to be exact, just roughly thinking of where they should be. And now I'm going to do the shine on the bikini and the bikini holder. Now I do have a video on shine if you'd like to have a look at that. I'll put a marker for that one there, because that can be pretty useful. And so basically what that involves is mapping out a reflection over the surface. So long as you're consistent with the shape. So I'm going to do a bit of a dark in the top left corner, and a little bit in the bottom right, and then so long as I'm relatively consistent, that'll look like a reflection. Because if you imagine a reflection on like a steel ball, and if you have a bunch of steel balls, the reflection will be the same on all of them, because reflection is based on the direction the surface is facing, not whether the surface is lit, because you can't sort of shade a mirror. And so I'm just putting those bits of darker tone there on these to make them look sort of metallic. Adding some edges around the side there as well. And around the rest of the hanger. Right, and then getting the bit of tone on the choker that I missed there. And then just taking a couple of bits of tone out, just to sort of allude to that kind of shine, that sort of leathery strapness to it. And realizing at some point I must have had a line of tone just randomly delete across the image there. That's okay, easy to fill in, easy to fix. And then adding a little bit of a sort of pupil, a darker section there. Maybe not like a hard black pupil on this one. You can do one, of course. But I'm just going to do that just to sort of soften the eyes and not make them too intense. That's looking pretty good. I'm just making a new layer here because I think I've forgotten that I already made a layer called Shines. Thought I'd save myself some time, pre-make and name the layers just to make sure I don't miss any steps. But the autopilot kicked in and I went to make a layer for a thing I'd already made a layer for. So the Shines layer here is just going to be, like it says, some shine. The drawing is essentially done, you can sort of tell that. And so now I'm just getting some white, and I'm going to make the shines just really simplistic. Like normally you can do the sort of cutout shapes, but here I'm just going to do circular blobs. I don't want to have too much sort of detail pulling attention from one sort of spot over another, so big round shapes are fine. I'm doing it over the top of the Lineart layer. The reason for that is sometimes I want it to overlay on things like the eyes, so I want it to go over the top of the edge of the iris, or I want to go over the top of the pupil. So I'll sit that on top of the Lineart layer. If you're not planning to do that, it can be handy to have it under the Lineart layer, just when you're going sort of close to the edge. Like you can see on the left-hand side of the head there's that extra bit of white that went over the Lineart layer that I didn't want. Now adding bits of shine, I'm trying to be as sparing as I can with it. If you have shine everywhere, it sort of loses its effectiveness. So I'm just trying to use it, but not go over the top with it. And so maybe a little bit of a bar there on the choker. I'm just going very pale with that. Then just some other little spots of it, like on the corner of the bag, maybe. And so that's that, being consistent with the shine as a way of making a thing look metallic. So I've got a big sort of shine in the top left and a bit of shine in the bottom, and that's making that sort of bikini look like it's a sort of pink metallic shape. It's all largely looking fairly correct, so the drawing's basically done here. I'm just going to do a couple of other little bits of polish. So for instance, just cleaning some bits up of the shine on the top there, and maybe adding a bit more roundness to the highlight on the eye. I'm just sort of zooming in to make sure I'm not sort of getting the wrong kind of edge to it. And on the other side as well. And maybe a little reflected shining out the corner there. And maybe a couple of little sort of bits on the rosy cheeks. That looks kind of cute. And now I'm going to control how strong that controlling layer, that lighting control layer, is going to be. And then maybe cloning one of them to see if I can use that to soften the line art a little bit. You can see putting it to pin light over the top of the ink can work pretty well, so long as you've got your sort of lines filled in. I'm just going to do a bit of a blur on that one and just lower the strength of it a bit. I just want a little bit of a subtle softening of the line art, just so it isn't sort of too harsh. If you want, you can sort of use a layer attached to the inks layer to tune that in a bit. I'm not going to do it a lot. I just want it a bit, just to soften it a little bit and have the line art take on some of the color of the flats around it. So fairly transparent. Now, next thing, I'm going to grab new layer, and I'm just going to fill that in just to give it a bit of coloured background, because the white can be a bit stark, so even just a simple colour that's roughly analogous to what I'm doing. So this is the whole image. You can see here is a lot of warm colours like pink through to yellow, and so I'm just going to find a colour kind of in the middle of that and have a bit of a pale desaturated version of it. That'll work pretty well. Yeah, that's looking okay. Just one other little touch, just while I'm looking at it here. I might grab a new layer just very quickly and go add glow and go to a color that's sort of close to the green of the eyes, but slightly warmer, and with a soft airbrush, just brush in a tiny little bit of it there just to give the eyes a bit of glow. It's much better, just to get the eyes a bit more attention. Right, with that, we are finished. So we've got the full illustration. We've gone all the way from sketch, line art, flats, shading, and a couple of little effects on top. You can see how that color controller layer really does help with the shading, making sure every bit of shading has the right color to it, so that can be really helpful. Now, if you've decided to draw along and you want to share your results on the Discord, I would absolutely love to see it. And if you enjoyed this one and want to try a sort of more involved, maybe more advanced version of this, there'll be another video coming out with the same subject, but in a slightly different style, less sort of chibified. Now, if you liked what you saw, coming up soon there'll be some videos on composition, robots, chibis, etc. And there'll be these 1-to-1 speed draw-alongs. So if you have any questions about the videos you've seen or videos you'd like to see, leave them in the comments. That can be a great way to support the channel. Also, pressing like, subscribe. If you want to join the Patreon, you can. Like I said before, I'll be starting up and opening up a very small number of spots for the in-person classes. So if you're interested in them, come join the Discord where the updates will be. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. You have a good one. Cheers. Bye.